My name is Brian Stakevicius. I am the MuleSoft Practice Manager at Big Compass. I have over 15 years of enterprise integration experience. The last 3 or so are mostly with iPaaS solutions. I have about 2 years of MuleSoft experience. I do have my MuleSoft Certified Developer certification. I do have to renew it in about a month. Laura?
Hey guys, I am Laura Walls. I'm a senior consultant with Big Compass. I have 6 years of MuleSoft experience, 8 years total of integration experience, and I have a little bit of AWS background. I started with my associate certificate for AWS and then ended up going back into the MuleSoft world, so I didn't get to use it much. I am MuleSoft 4 certified, and that's all. Hand it off to you, Brian.
Great. So today we're going to cover information about best practices about logging. We're going to start high level and generic about why is it important to log. I'm going to cover the difference between logging and auditing. In some applications, you also have audit requirements in addition to logging requirements. Laura is going to cover a lot about logging strategies. Laura is also going to show a demonstration of using the log4j configuration in a MuleSoft application to send logs over to Splunk. And finally, we'll conclude with the 9 essential laws of MuleSoft logging success. Why log in the first place? I know that's kind of obvious. Generally, when we are developing a MuleSoft application, or any application for that matter, we're logging for debugging information. We're going to certainly be using much more heavy amounts of logs or traces when we are doing our initial integration tests. I mean, unit tests, you should be able to step through that on your local environment. But then, of course, as the application transitions over to user acceptance tests and finally into production, you're logging for supporting. And as an application developer, never, ever, ever assume that you're going to be the one maintaining your code. Somebody else may have to maintain your code, and you're going to have to get information out of the logs to try to identify where the problem is and what the resolution is. Another reasons, of course, for logging, tracing interactions between systems, and getting some information about those interactions, and of course, visibility into your systems. So we're going to start off with some logging, not so good, or even as I put, bad practices. Obviously, the worst practice is not to have a logging standard. That basically means you're going to be dealing with the wild, wild west. For every developer, there's going to be an equal and opposite developer in terms of what they want to log. And that makes it really, really, really difficult to maintain your applications in production. The next 2 bullet points you can kind of combine. Putting in logs that say, I am here, well, that doesn't help anybody. That's static text. It also really doesn't give you a lot of context. You want to make sure that your log statements are as informative as possible. And we'll talk a little bit more about some good practices in order to accomplish that. Payload logging, my personal opinion, don't ever just log your entire payload. Now, there are some applications where you can get away with it. The issue you have with payload logging is you may be passing in personally identifiable information, or PII, or other sensitive information, which is now in plain text in your logs. And that is obviously a security hole. So avoid that. The last one isn't so much a logging best practice, it's really more of a cautionary issue, is that if you're relying on CloudHubs on MuleSoft, you're limited to 100 megabytes per application or 30 days. And every time you redeploy that application, the existing logs go away. So just be aware of that. So, the bad practice is to fully rely on CloudHub logs. Just be aware of the limitations of CloudHub logs. So now let's start talking about some best practices. Well, first of all, start defining your logging standards. Whether you want to use JSON, which MuleSoft allows you to do, whether you want to use key value pairs, or any other type of format, plain text, whatever, you're going to want to try to define a logging standard, especially if you're going to be feeding these logs into other systems such as the ELK stack or into Splunk, which is what Laura will be showing us about. Having a standard way of logging messages allows the people who are maintaining your code to understand, okay, there's going to be some uniform standards that we're dealing with. I already talked about creating some informative messages. It's a good idea in a MuleSoft application, log right when you enter an API, right when you leave an API. It's also a good idea to have, I'm invoking this API, return back from this API. Again, maybe those will be more trace level messages, which you can eliminate as you go into production, but just helps you. And also when you're logging information about your system calls, you could start detecting some performance degradation. Like you may find early on, you're talking to Salesforce and you're getting your response back in a matter of 3 or 4 seconds. And then for some reason that starts degrading to 30 or 40 seconds. You may need to try to understand why you're starting to have that issue. And of course, always try to have some sort of correlation ID or request identifier that allows you to trace your transactions across your solution, especially in the MuleSoft world, where you may have an experience, a process, and multiple system APIs. If you can have an identifier to that request that traverses through your whole system, that allows you for a lot more transaction logging capability. Whoops. Best practice also is persisting logs to a system. Again, with CloudHub, you're limited to 30 days or 100 megabytes. So you may want to be persisting these logs to another solution, such as just your local file store or to a different application such as Splunk or ELK. It allows you to maintain a little bit of history. And then of course, it allows other users to access and support your systems. Take advantage of log categories. We'll get a little bit more into that. That is different from log levels within MuleSoft. And again, of course, log enough, but not too much. And that really comes to a business decision in terms of logging your payload. Again, there's some applications that may be perfectly fine. There's other applications where you're transmitting PII in there, and that's a no-no. So be aware of that. I'm going to talk a little bit now about what the difference is between logging and auditing. Logging is simple, I shouldn't say simple. It's more about what happened and what went wrong and how do I fix the problem. Companies will generally archive their logs, but they don't have to keep them forever. Whereas audit logs, or I'll just say auditing from here out, are a different animal. They're basically who did what and when. And you're basically, the purpose of audit logs is for non-repudiation. In other words, I said I did something, you say I didn't do something. Well, the audit logs are going to tell the truth. Audit logs generally have retention policies. They may be part of an overall enterprise's records management strategy. And especially with public sector customers, they may be using FOIA types of interactions, or they also may be used in legal proceedings, especially when you're dealing with financial transactions. So just be aware of that. MuleSoft does provide an audit log query API. You're going to have to develop either your own API that leverages that API or your own application that leverages the audit log query of API. That's going to give you the who and the when, who interacted with which objects in the system and when did they do that. So you can retrieve that information and go ahead and perform analysis of it. And basically, if you need to prove something actually happened, leverage the audit log query API. Another practice that I've seen is that companies will develop their own API that will be leveraged by the other applications. That's obviously done asynchronously to put audit information in there. So either way will work, just develop a practice. Don't store your audit logs on CloudHub, and don't use your standard log activities for audit logs. Make sure they're a little bit separate. And of course, auditing and logging requirements need to be defined and part of your overall code review process. I know that could be a little bit tedious, but at the same time, you'll catch some things if you don't do it. And finally, when you do have audit logs, restrict their access to it as opposed to debugging logs. So we've covered a little bit about logging best practices and the difference between auditing and logging. Those were the higher level parts of this presentation. And now we're going to dive into much more specifics about MuleSoft. Laura and I have done our best to try to account for all the deployments, the platform deployments you have for your runtime plane. We're going to do our best to cover them. We may miss one or two here and there. We may be a little bit inaccurate, especially when it comes to runtime fabric, but we'll do our best. But if you have any questions about any specific deployment option, feel free to add them in chat. In general, MuleSoft will have runtime logs and application logs. The logging levels for these do follow the Apache log4j hierarchy. So it goes from fatal, which generally gives you your least amount of messages, to all, which gives you everything. MuleSoft has added a few log levels to that, so just be aware of that. But in general, if you're familiar with how Apache log4j.level hierarchy works, that's how the MuleSoft logging also works. So application logs, when you're developing an application in Anypoint Studio, of course, you deal with the log4j2.xml, and it'll go ahead and take advantage of configuration for your logs. There are different places to view your application logs depending on your deployment platform. And they're listed here locally in Anypoint Studio. You just look at the console window. If you're running from command line, OS. If you have on-premise or hybrid applications, that's going to be your Mule Home. If you're in CloudHub, Runtime Manager, and finally RTF, which stands for Runtime Fabric, you access the application logs through Ops Center. We could probably spend hours just on those different types of logs. So this is a bit of a summary. So runtime logs, there's going to be a few different flavors of those depending on your deployment platform. The classic mule_ee.log, you're going to see that in your if you have an on-premise or hybrid deployment, you'll also see that out of Anypoint Studio. And that's going to contain information about application lifecycle events, and you can configure those through your log4j.xml. What I've shown you here on the picture at the bottom is the CloudHub logs. You have to be in Runtime Manager. And you see generally when you deploy, you have a system log and you have also your worker thread logs. When you click and you want to download the logs, you're going to have two types of logs to download. One of them is the actual application logs, and that's the first one where it says logs. And the second one is diagnostics, and that's going to be a Java trace. So somewhat similar to mule_e, not entirely the same, but that's what you're going to have when CloudHub logs. And the bonus, Runtime Fabric. Runtime Fabric has 4 different types of logs. Obviously, it's going to have your application logs. It's going to have your API proxy logs, specific services for Runtime Fabric. And finally, since Runtime Fabric is being managed by Kubernetes, there's going to be Kubernetes log information also. Again, those are generally accessible from the Ops Center in Runtime Fabric. But wait, there's more. I don't know if everybody's getting that little picture on the left-hand side. You have to be of a certain age to understand what the reference there is. If you want, you can also subscribe to Anypoint Monitoring Logging. You do have to have a Titanium subscription for that. And that gives you 200 gigabytes of storage per production core. So it goes away from the application level specific limitations to more of how many vCores do you have allocated at production. And also through Anypoint Monitoring, you can have enhanced log analysis. That is all part of that. Again, you have to have the Titanium subscription. You could actually even increase the storage per production core. I think you can actually get up into the terabytes if you really, really need to do so. Contact your friendly local MuleSoft customer success person or your friendly local MuleSoft account executive for more information if you're interested. Net level logging. And then finally, if you work with batch scopes, MuleSoft is going to be automatically entering information about those batch scopes in your logs, how many messages are going to be in a batch step. And finally, when you get to the on continue phase of the batch scope, it'll tell you exactly how many records it processed, how many succeeded, and how many failed. That comes out of the box as part of when you do interactions with your batch scope. So what I've done so far is I've covered basic logging essentials, difference between logging and auditing, and then I went into a little bit more details about how MuleSoft logging works. By default, it's asynchronous. You configure it within your applications. There are also some system logs. Accessing those logs depends on which is your deployment platform for your runtime plane. So now we're going to get a little bit more into logging strategies. What you're going to see a little later on is you're going to see a demonstration from Laura on using Splunk. There's 2 ways to configure Splunk, and again, it depends on your deployment. If you're a CloudHub deployment, you have to go ahead and configure your log4j. Again, in Splunk, as we all know, Splunk has forwarders, indexers, and search heads. So the content that's presented here is, well, how do you get the information to the forwarder in order for Splunk to go ahead and access it? So again, on the right-hand side, that's CloudHub. You have to use the log4j appender. Laura is going to go ahead and demo that. When you do deploy to CloudHub, it is recommended you disable the CloudHub logs. Actually, I think you must disable the CloudHub logs. And you can either use TCP or UDP and also, or HTTP with a token. I think Laura's using HTTP with a token. I'm sorry, Laura, I think I'm giving away your entire demo, but that's all right.
No, you're fine.
The left-hand side of this diagram shows how to configure Splunk if you're doing on-premise or hybrid Mule deployments, basically the steps, which I don't show here, but I can explain, is you have to go into Runtime Manager, add a server, then add a server group, which includes that server. When you create your server group, you can go ahead and enable the Splunk plugin, and then you can go ahead and configure Splunk event tracking from that plugin. And that will enable the events to be forwarded to the universal forwarder, and then you're on your way in Splunk. So I'm going to do right now is I'm going to transfer it over to Laura, who's going to cover ELK and going to cover strategies and have a cool demo. Go ahead, Laura.
Thank you, Brian. All right, so let's talk a little bit about ELK. It's one of the more common logging platforms that people use these days between ELK and Splunk. Those two, I think, are pretty encompassing in our market. So the left side, you'll see figure 1. It is using something called file beats to trigger logging to Logstash, Elasticsearch, and then ultimately you go into Kibana for your visual. So the way this works, you're going to install file beats on your server and point that to monitor your log files or a specific location that your logs are going to be dropped into. And then it's going to collect these events and forward them to Elasticsearch or Logstash using something called a harvester. So FileBeat starts this harvester, and the harvester reads one log at a time and sends that data to what's called a libby. And then that libby aggregates the events and sends the aggregated data onto Elasticsearch, Logstash, or even you could use Kafka or AWS Redis if you wanted to. So that's the left side. The right side, you'll see the second figure. And that is going from your MuleSoft application via an API call or a polling scheduler and sending it onto your ELK Stack server. So MuleSoft is going to be using the log4j2 configured settings that you can customize and add an ELK TCP appender to. That appender is going to push those logs to your ELK stack, and some config changes that you need to make to your ELK server to make this happen. Go into your Logstash pipeline settings, specifically the access_conf.log file. And you need to add your input server, your port number, enable use TCP to equal true, and then any other kind of pattern settings that you need to have your log files outputted with. And then the bottom figure here is just a more simplified file beats through Logstash, through Elasticsearch, through Kibana. And then from here, we're going to talk a little bit more about logging strategies. So the first logging strategy we're going to talk about today is an on-premise runtime in combination with on-premise or cloud ELK or Splunk instance. So you're going to configure your Splunk Universal Forwarder or your ELK file beats to monitor an application or a log location on your system. And now this is only going to be applicable when you have access to logs. Sometimes if you have sensitive information, HIPAA, PII, anything like that, you might not always have access to those logs. So the strategy is only going to work when you do. And the benefits of this is that you're going to have your separated application logging from any kind of logging overhead that will help your application performance. And any kind of large log files, you'll be able to handle those without hindering your application. It's going to add robustness by having a persistent file. Like Brian was saying, CloudHub has some limitations where you're only going to get 100 megabytes or 30 days, whichever comes first. So having these persistent log files in Splunk or ELK can help you maintain some kind of logging history. You're going to use the Splunk sim log event or Logstash layout for formatting your messages. You can add any kind of date or timestamp patterns, whether or not you want JSON output or plain text, anything along those lines. And this is the preferred approach for an on-premise solution. So you have your on-premise runtime completely separated from your log instances, since they're going to be cloud or Splunk. And that's going to have some persistence, historical data, and added reliability to your logging. So strategy 2 is going to deal with on-premise runtime and on-premise or cloud ELK or Splunk. Again, this is another way of leveraging this combination. MuleSoft will be using a log42j file that you can customize settings and add custom loggers, custom pattern matching, whatever you want to do. So this log appender is found in source main resources, and the components that make up your log42j logging file are going to be loggers, which are going to define your specific packages for logging. You have your async loggers, that's where you define your appenders that are going to be used for logging. And then your appenders themselves define the delivery of your log events, the layouts, patterns, all of that good stuff we talked about before for strategy 1. So moving on to strategy 3, this is going to leverage a CloudHub runtime and Cloud ELK or Splunk. So as we've said several times now, CloudHub logging has its limitations, 100 megabytes, 30-day limit. Non-titanium users do not have log search capabilities under API monitoring. So this is just another reason you'll need to reach out to a secondary logging application or source of some sort. And your logs are lost upon application deletion, which is a bummer, especially if you need some kind of historical preservation of your logs. You can create a custom log appender, such as some examples here are Jelf appenders, socket appenders, Splunk HTTP, which I'll be showing you more about this one in my demo upcoming. And to implement this, you'll need to disable CloudHub logging. And when you disable that logging, you'll be able to enable either ELK, Splunk. There's a couple other ones that I don't have off the top of my head for you, but there's several different logging options there in CloudHub that you can go ahead and change your logging over to. So strategy 4 is a CloudHub application and on-prem ELK or Splunk instance. Now this should be used whenever your connections to a data center are not possible with inbound traffic. Now that could be because you have private information on that server, or you're working with a government server that has extremely limited access to that data. It is going to be initiated by a scheduler that's going to pull CloudHub APIs for your logs. And this is going to help you. This is going to help you out with picking those logs up from a server, or you can also use a RESTful API call that also goes out and gets those logs for you. Now you'll need to ensure CloudHub API calls are within the SLA to avoid any kind of throttling. Now strategy 5, we're just going to briefly touch on this, is your highly scalable solution. So this is going to introduce a highly scalable queue between your application and your ELK and Splunk logging. The most common is going to be an Amazon SQS connector that MuleSoft has out of the box. You just need to add your server configurations to that in your queue name. And you can use Kafka as well and have the Kafka appender in your log42j file. This is going to ensure high availability and enable you to log your event messages reliably. So from here, we're going to cut over to our demo. And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. All right. So you should be seeing my Splunk Enterprise instance.
Looks good, Laura. I see it just fine.
Awesome. Cool. All right. So I went with Splunk Enterprise. You can also go with Splunk Cloud. If you have CloudHub, it's easier to integrate with Splunk Cloud instance. The first thing you're going to want to do is go to your settings and configure a data input. And this is going to be the HTTP event collector for the purposes of this demo. It's really easy to configure. You just add a new HTTP event collector. You'll have this screen pop up. Your source type, you need to have log4j, since that's what MuleSoft is using to output these logs. And then you want to set default index to main. I believe it's going to be set to main regardless if you set this or not, but just to be sure, it's always a good thing to set that to main. And then once this is generated, you're going to get your token. And this is what's going to allow you to connect your MuleSoft logs to your Splunk instance. Just one more thing to note. You'll want to go into your global settings, make sure your default source type's log4j, default index main, and then grab your port number because you'll need this for your MuleSoft configuration as well. And you can enable SSL if you want things to be a little bit more secure, but since I'm using localhost and the generic port, I disabled that for the purposes of this demo. So now let's go over to MuleSoft. All right, so here you'll get the first looks at the demo. It's pretty simple. I have a polling scheduler that's going to listen every 1 second to see if I have any logs generated. I'm setting a correlation ID just to have some kind of specific unique identifier with each of my log messages. And then I'm outputting that with a message logging content for MuleSplunk demo. Now here's where, you'll log your more specific messages that you need for your application.
So Laura, I have a question before you move on. So right below the level, you have the category.
Yes.
How would you use the category?
Okay.
You're not going to demo it here, but yeah, how would you use that?
Right, yeah. Your categories, you can use these in combination with your log4j settings, and this is going to enable you to turn on and off specific flow logging in your Anypoint Studio runtime manager instance.
So it allows you for more granular logging, like as opposed to just using info, you add the category, gives you more granular logging based on your app.
Yeah, you get more control over what you want to see in each of your specific flows, because usually instead of having, one XML file under your source main mule, you'll have, I don't know, 8 to 12.
Yep.
They each have a different name, so you don't want to log everything all the time. That would take up a lot of resources, a lot of space. So cool. Having this category, it enables you to specifically pinpoint which of these application files you want to handle at the moment and log that out. Cool. It's very good for debugging.
Cool. Thanks, Laura.
Yep, sure. All right, so we go into our log4j file. I believe I'm in the wrong one. Disregard. That's our test file. We go into our log4j.xml file, and here's where you're going to define your appenders that connects you to Splunk, ELK. I have a JELF appender here just for example visibility. We're not doing anything with this, but you have your name, your host, your port, and then you have your logging levels, your timestamp, all these things that you want to configure for that. The Splunk one is much more simple. It's right here. We have Splunk HTTP as the name. We've got our URL with our port number that we grabbed from the Splunk Enterprise instance. And then services collector raw. This is just saying we are using the HTTP event collector. Provide property authorization. And then this is our token that we had generated from our Splunk Enterprise once we created that connector. And then I've defined a very simple pattern layout for logging to be outputted. And we go down here to our loggers, and we're going to, under the async root level info tag, you could have this say debug, whatever you want your logs to output as, but we're going to go with info. And then I call my appender here using an appender reference.
With that, so does that, Laura, if you go back to that, so that level, does that override what you put in your actual logger activity, or how does that work?
Yes. So this, anything in your properties here is going to override what you're going to have in your logger. And then,
Okay.
yeah, if I, for some reason, wouldn't have had level equals info, it would go to whatever I had in the logger itself.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Okay, cool. Thank you.
So some things to note before we start up. You'll need some POM dependencies to get these things to work. So for like Jelf, you'll need your log/Jelf. The Splunk dependencies are down here, and these are what are going to populate your jar files to actually have your application run correctly. So let's go ahead and fire this up. And a cool thing about this, once I get some logging going, and then we'll switch over to the Splunk Enterprise instance to visually see what's going on here. It's also going to log your startup and your stop messages, so you can see your uptimes of your application, which is handy when you're trying to debug anything that's down. So every second, this is polling. I've got my correlation ID over here, and then my message. I'm going to let this go for just a few more seconds to collect a little bit more data. And then I'm going to stop this instance, and let's hop over to Splunk. So for this, I have created a dashboard. If I can click the right things, that would be great. Sorry. Search and reporting. It's easier just to get it that way. And dashboards, BC Splunk demo dashboard. So the generic dashboard I made for this was incoming source equals log4j. And I believe I have a 30-minute timestamp on this. Like I was saying, if we go here, you can see your app has started. And then let's go back here. Correlation ID, you'll be able to search for your unique identifier on your logs, your message, whatever you want it to say here. I just have logging content from Splunk demo. Your host, localhost, port 88, your source, where it's coming from, source type, log4j. And here you can see when it has stopped. Up for 0 days, 0 hours, 0 minutes, 27 seconds. Like I said, this can be handy when you're trying to troubleshoot some instance where your app isn't working correctly, or it went down during a specific period, whatever you are working with there. And that wraps up the demo. Do you have anything to add on this, Brian?
No, I don't. I think I liked how easy it was to configure the log4j.xml. Could you make that log4j.xml default as part of a template within MuleSoft?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so that would also be best practice too, is if you're going to have a common logging, if you're going to have a logging strategy, which I already said you must, you should, if you can define that, make the customizations in your template, then that really makes it much more simpler for developers to set up. That's pretty cool.
Yeah, for sure. I will stop sharing and pass it back over to you.
Awesome. Thank you, Laura. I will make sure I'm sharing the right screen here. So can you see my slides again?
Not just yet.
Oh, how about if I press share?
Yeah, there you go.
Now. Whew. Okay,
Perfect.
Technology. All right. So Laura just covered some logging strategies in MuleSoft, accounting for various different deployments in MuleSoft and leveraging either ELK or Splunk. And then she just showed a demonstration of how you would use integration to Splunk from what would normally be deployed to CloudHub for simplicity's sakes. She just showed it from Anypoint Studio. And she also explained the difference between the logging level and also what was the other part of it, Laura?
You're fine. The logging level versus, you can have your categories.
Category, thank you. Category, yes, yes. So she also demonstrated the difference between the logging level and showed how you can use the category in your log activities. So we're going to conclude with covering the 9 essential logs of MuleSoft Logging. And I have a link at the bottom of the slide. This is actually a blog post that one of my colleagues created regarding these laws. So let's cover these laws. Again, law number 0, which isn't here, is have a logging strategy to begin with. Again, we understand your strategy may evolve as your maturity using MuleSoft evolves, and also just as you learn from some of the applications you deploy to production, like, gee, we need to make some changes to it. Make sure that they have a meaningful context. Again, saying I am here, I am here, I am here doesn't really help anything. Laura demonstrated, well, didn't demonstrate, but showed you where you can use categories. And that allows you to have a little more fine-grained control over what you are logging. If you suspect there's a problem in a specific flow, perhaps you have a category specific to that flow and enable that within runtime manager. And then that allows you to only grab the information out of that particular flow. Log as much as you can without logging too much. Again, just be really, 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 really careful if you're logging payload. The correct logging level, again, it follows the MuleSoft follows the Apache level standard, so all the way from fatal down to any. Most people tend to stick with info, but you could, of course, add or modify your logging as necessary. Laura showed you how you can go ahead and use a correlation identifier so that you can go ahead and get a little bit more either instance level, or you can use an identifier to show a flow of a message from your experience API through your process APIs to your system APIs. So you can correlate the whole transaction. Machine readable format, again, if you're going to feed this into Splunk or ELK, that allows a user to go ahead and create much more powerful searches. You may want to standardize on JSON. You can set that up in Log4j, or I know MuleSoft Professional Services does have a custom connector, which is basically a JSON logger. If you want to use that, the code's available on GitHub. I've already said it probably about 100 times already. Be careful when you're logging your payload that may contain sensitive information. You may want to have some contextual information on what you're doing as opposed to just troubleshooting. And finally, as Laura showed, Log4j framework, you can go ahead, you use this efficiently. You can go ahead and set up a standard within a template so that all your developers start with your standard already defined Log4j. And that just makes everybody else's life a lot easier. And again, the source of our 9 essential logs, we have a blog post on this, which goes into a lot more detail about each of these particular laws of MuleSoft logging. So with that, we've talked about, just to summarize, talked about some logging overview, some logging principles, what are bad practices, what are good practices. We then brought it much more specific to MuleSoft, talked about how MuleSoft logging works. We went over strategies, we had a demo, and then we concluded with the 9 laws for MuleSoft logging.